Yes, we went through Jim Crow. Yes, we went through slavery, all of those things. But like our Jewish brothers and sisters, our people survived and thrived. We prevailed. We built Black Wall Streets. We were Black soldiers who fought the Civil War. So we pride ourselves in the fact that, yes, that's what happened to us, but it does not define us. For somebody to then go back and take our story and then try to demonize the only democracy in the Middle East where there is actual slaves all over the place within the Arab Muslim world, where Christians are being slaughtered in that same region, and pick out the one region where people are free and then demonize that as the one that's committing genocide. Yes, that makes us very angry, not just because it's not true, but because, again, it's exploiting the specific people.
Hello and welcome to State of the Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. American Jews and the Black community were traditionally allies in the fight for civil rights in America. But more recently, modern woke ideology tries to paint them as implacable foes. As if the Black community are on the side of victims and the oppressed, while Jews, somehow they became white colonizers and oppressors. My guest today thinks that's a terrible mistake. Pastor Dumisani Washington is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. He's also the author of Zionism and the Black Church, Why Standing with Israel Will Be a Defining Issue for Christians of Color in the 21st Century. Together we discuss why Christians should support the State of Israel, understanding that the Islamist ideology coming for Jews is coming for them next. And we talk about how many in the Black community feel exploited by the Palestinian movement that has hijacked their story, their narrative, their struggle to try to make the case for violent terrorism, when in fact the Black community should be standing shoulder to shoulder with American Jews and with the State of Israel. We filmed this episode on location in Washington, D.C. at the Israeli-American Council Conference. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Canadians are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Pastor Washington, welcome to State of the Nation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Filmed here on location, Washington, D.C. as part of the Israeli-American Council National Summit.
Thank you.
Since October 7th, a lot of Jews have been feeling very isolated and abandoned by communities they thought were their allies. They looked out to people they thought should naturally be allies, including the Black community, including Christians. And here I am having the privilege of talking to a Black Christian. So tell me, since October 7th, how that shock has in fact strengthened your determination to stand for the Jewish community and with Israel. What happened?
I think that, first of all, for our organization, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, we focus on, obviously, the relationship between the Black and Jewish community, Israel, Africa. And we had been seeing the escalation of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism in the West, particularly the United States, on a pretty steep incline. And I have to connect October 7th to May 2021, the Gaza war, where Hamas fired somewhat 4,000 rockets, or Islamic Jihad, I believe it was. Percentage of those rockets hit Palestinian territories. I referenced that because that was a switch that we saw, that the anti-Semitism literally on the streets of the United States, New York, LA, Chicago, Jews being accosted, stores being, bombarded, the type of thing. This happened, again, 3 years or more than 2 years before October 7th. So October 7th comes. What we had said as a staff after May 2021 was that given where we are as a nation, what's going on, the rhetoric, the Hamas talking points that had already infused much of media, college campuses, all of those things that are concerned, that we weren't predicting on October 7th, we weren't trying to be savants. We were saying that the next thing is going to be really, really bad. Of course, October 7th comes. October 7th was a Saturday. By Monday, Tuesday of the next week, colleges had already organized, and the Hamas protests or support were already happening in places like California. They had already been organized. It was very clear that these things are already in the can. Boom, they already happened. So for us, it was as much of a nightmare, obviously, first and foremost for our Israeli brothers and sisters. And then on the streets, what's happening here, we felt our fear was that that would happen with the next thing that happened. Unfortunately, the next thing was on October 7th. And the genie's not back in the bottle. School has now resumed after the break, and right off the bat, You have these protests, and these kids are literally enrolling in school and being protested, right?
You're saying now is so familiar to me because I know now Jews and Israelis have been fighting against this, but give me that I'm a little bit confused that I'm asking is, why is this your battle?
There's a lot of answers to that question, and let me do this along the same lines of what I was saying. Since probably especially the 1960s, no other group has been more exploited when it comes to the demonization of the Jewish state than the Black American or the African community. Hence, Israel's apartheid state. Lie. But apartheid is a real thing. Israel's a Jim Crow state. Lie. My family experienced Jim Crow. Israel's Zionism is racism. All of these things that were basically set forth, particularly with the disinformation of the KGB. Those who are aware of the fact the Palestine Liberation Organization was a formation of the KGB, formed in 1964. In 1969, it adopts Yasser Arafat as its chairman. What's the first thing that he does? He goes to the Black American community. You see him with pictures of Louis Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson. Why? He couldn't care less about the Black community. That wasn't his point. His point was that if he could sell his genocidal aims as a social justice movement, it would work. It was brilliantly devious because some 60 years almost later, look at where we are. On our campuses, these kids couldn't find Gaza on a map, but they want to free Palestine. They have no idea what's going on. They have no idea what Hamas does to its own people, but they believe that they're on the right side of history in large part because of how my community was exploited. They see it as a justice issue, as a civil rights issue. That's why. And so for me, not only is it wrong for what they're saying about Israel, I know that it's exploiting my people, and I have South African family. I mean, I have South African family who experienced apartheid. Of course, Black American family who experienced Jim Crow. So when we hear Israel, compared to that, yes, it makes us morally indignant.
It's fascinating to hear that because I'd always known that anti-Semitism involves a degree of projection and that countries are often living out their own neuroses onto Israel when they speak about it. That's why in Ireland they view it through the lens of the fight between the Catholics and Protestants, and the British will see it through the lens of imperialism, and the Australians will view it through the lens of colonialism because they're actually arguing about themselves through Israel. But I'd never thought about it from the perspective of the victims, yes, who are coming and saying, no, this is our struggle. We're the victims of apartheid. We're the victims of racism. We're the victims of Jim Crow. You feel exploited by the way that the Palestinian cause has hijacked your history? What's interesting is that the Ireland example that you use, there's pictures of Nelson Mandela, there's pictures of him with Kafia, right? Because that was exported there as well. They're using it, as you said, almost like a mascot, right? But it has nothing to do. I'm not going to speak to the Ireland issue, but I'm saying, but they would use apartheid in that way. So yes, there's a, I don't know if I would use the word, okay, yeah, exploitation is exactly the word. But it's not so much, like for our organization, for example, it's not so much the exclamations of a victim in that sense, right? Like our Jewish brothers and sisters. One of the things I had the privilege of doing when I was formally in my position with Christians United for Israel, we did it with something called the Mizrahi Project, telling the story of the 850,000 Jewish refugees from North Africa and Middle East. And one of the themes throughout the interview, we interviewed first and second generation people from Libya, Jews from Iraq, Jews from other parts of the Arab world, and how they were expelled, how they wound up leaving. And the story was not one of victimization. Yes, they left penniless, their lands were taken, their businesses were taken. Most of those Jews, of course, as you already know, went to Israel, built Israel. Some of them came to other parts of the West, the United States and UK, and moved on with their lives, right? Their thing was now they didn't sit there in what had actually happened to them in the victimization of this is what happened to us, even though it was horrific what happened to them. And it was a moving forward. That's how we see the parallel. Yes, we went through Jim Crow. Yes, we went through slavery, all of those things. But like our Jewish brothers and sisters, our people survived and thrived. We prevailed. We built Black Wall Streets. We were Black soldiers who fought the Civil War. So we pride ourselves in the fact that, yes, that's what happened to us, but it does not define us. For somebody to then go back and take our story and then try to demonize the only democracy in the Middle East where there is actual slaves all over the place within the Arab Muslim world, where Christians are being slaughtered in that same region, and pick out the one region where people are free and then demonize that as the one that's committing genocide. Yes, that makes us very angry, not just because it's not true, but because, again, it's exploiting a specific people. For example, which is why the United Nations, who just yesterday demonized the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria once again. But what have they said about the 60, 70,000 Christians who've been slaughtered in Nigeria over the last 20 years? What have they said about the almost 1 million slaves in Libya?
What are they? Nothing. They'll spend the lion's share of their time demonizing Israel. That's already bad. But the other part of that, what about the Christians in Iran? What about the Uyghur Muslims in China? They give almost no attention to that, which also fuels more of the genocide. Because if I'm the leader of a despotic regime and I'm doing all kinds of heinous things to my people, and not only am I not being called out, but I get to dogpile on Israel, of course that's great for me, because not only am I not being called out, I get to then bash Israel and bash the Jews. This is what's been going on for decades. And October 7th was just a flashpoint in that.
I'm intrigued by how you made that connection just now between the Black story and the Jewish story, is where, of course, African Americans took so much inspiration from the story of Moses and liberation and promised land, but specifically that refusal to be a victim. Yes. Because sometimes it feels that we live in a world now where being a victim, claiming victim status gives you the ultimate moral authority. And the tragedy of Israelis is they refuse to be victims. And I say, no, we managed to stop being victims. That automatically puts you in the class of the oppressors.
Yes.
But here you are not just telling, I think, a countercultural story about the importance of standing with Israel, even within the Black community. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's something of a countercultural story to say, no, we're not going to get swept along with the victim narrative. We take responsibility. We move on. I mean, how do you see those narratives playing out within modern Black America?
What's interesting, again, we'll go back to the 60s, not that everything hinges on that, but just back for frame of reference. When you consider what we call the Black American story, and I talk about this in my book, Zionism in the Black Church, we tell with great pride and with great thankfulness in terms of how we see the story. Our story, and now again, no people are monoliths, obviously, but just in the overarching part of the story is a story of a people whose faith in God was rewarded by them not only surviving, but again, moving forward. This is why, for example, within our culture, what we call the Negro spirituals, they're said in the Bible, but almost all of them in the Old Testament. Go Down Moses, Joshua Fits the Battle of Jericho, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot.
Go Down Moses is a favorite around the family Passover Seder.
Absolutely. So I'm saying it's a universal song that came out of our struggle that we gave to the world, right? Of course, what was it based on? Moses and the children of Israel, right? And what was the point of the story? The point of the story was when Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. It's a mournful when you hear the music, but it's still a celebration. It's in the music itself. There's the tension of here's what happened, but we know how that story ended. It's ended at the Red Sea with all the Pharaoh's army, destroyed. So that has been an ethos within the Black American, particularly Christian context for centuries. This is still the case now, that our leaders would often draw on biblical characters, not for the purpose of victimization, but to say, this is what God did. These people were facing these situations. They called on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he moved. Some of our greatest abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, they were devout Christians. They actually called on God. And the point of that was that for us as a people, yes, we faced these same types of things, and yes, we achieved and we thrived because God was on our side, because we loved our families, all of those things. I tell my Jewish friends often, when you gather around the Seder table and you eat bitter herbs and you do the whole thing, the point isn't Pharaoh. The point of the story is not Pharaoh and how mean the Egyptians were and how evil they were. The point is that God delivered you from it, so you actually experience it, even by God saying in Torah, eat these herbs. And when your children ask you what meaneth this ceremony, you tell them the whole point of that. God,
we know the whole Haggadah off by heart, but
that's the point. The point is your children are going to ask you. And the child's going to look and go, does it make any sense to me? Same thing in the African-American community. We're supposed to be able to talk about those things that we went through, but not in the context of, oh, and woe is us, and oh, we're so lowly. No, Zionism became a rallying cry for Black and African leaders as well. They saw what Theodore Herzl and the other modern founding fathers do was rallying a people that had been dispossessed for millennia, who are wanting to rebuild their homeland. So you had even Marcus Garvey, they called his movement Black Zionism, right? This was even for those who would not have considered themselves Zionists, this movement, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had a Back to Africa movement. This is back in the early parts of the 1900s. Many people called it Black Zionism.
Fascinating.
Yes, sir. But you'll see that all throughout.
I'm actually not familiar with this. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
So what he was doing, Marcus Garvey, who
An African-American?
African-American. Well, he was born, I believe, in the islands, in the West Indies. But again, became an African-American legend in the sense that he believed that Black Americans or Black people in the diaspora would only have true agency if they were to return to Africa and rebuild it as a strong economic power, all of those things. And he's not the only person who felt that way. But he represents one of the Black Americans, one of the iconic ones, right, who actually drew on that. And it was called, that movement began to be coined the term Black Zionism. This is a Black person's return, doing what we saw the Jewish people doing. Even during this time, Israel had not become a reality yet. But of course, Zionism starts in the 1800s in terms of, not Zionism starts, but this modern move begins to actually manifest itself in the late 1800s, and it begins to become a reality. It's always fascinating to tell people, while that was happening, the Muslim Brotherhood is formed in 1928 as a counter to what the Jews are actually doing, even though Israel is not a reality yet in terms of being reborn. Black Americans and Black Africans saw Zionism as a rallying cry for them as well, which is why the modern state, the first foreign minister is Golda Meir, and the Black leaders see her as the mother of Africa. Julius Nyerere, who was the president of Tanzania, if I'm not mistaken, called her the mother of Africa in terms of their, not in a petulant sense, but what they're saying is that here there is this Israel reaching out. Golda Meir saying,
I think Moshe Sharet was technically the first foreign minister.
Okay, yes.
Meir was definitely pivotal.
Yes, sir.
In the early
During that time, yes, sir. Thank you. In the early 1950s. And so what she did was that the Mashav, it was born through her efforts, right? And what
Israel's regional cooperation program.
Yes, the agriculture, science, technical, and medicine, all these things. And what she was saying, and I'm paraphrasing, we had to relearn these things for our own independence, and we're willing to share these things with Africa, which is by the 1970s, Israel has more embassies in Africa than the United States, more embassies than any other country other than the United States, right? Throughout Africa. This is from the 40s now to the 1970s. Why? Because of this deep cooperation between the two. What disrupts this, for people who are listening, what disrupted? The 1973 Yom Kippur War. Israel is demonized as recolonizing Africa. That's where that type of rhetoric really began to take a shift. Yes.
Fascinating. I mean, I was familiar with the story of Israel investing in regional cooperation within Africa. I wasn't familiar with the story of Black Zionism as some sort of Black, quote-unquote, return to Africa, although I think really the story of Liberia is perhaps the closest parallel that we have to.
And as I mind you, either returning to Africa or just rebuilding their own communities. In terms of Zionism, that became a rallying cry. We're going to do what we see our Jewish brothers.
And it's fascinating to hear you say that, because I really do think that in Israel, especially after October 7th, given the way that Israeli society was rallied together, people took responsibility, Israel does have a lot to teach and inspire the world, and particularly minorities as well. So you mentioned the book that you wrote, Zionism and the Black Church. Why standing with Israel is the defining issue for Christians of color in the 21st century. Now, you wrote this in 2012, when Zionism was less of a dirty word in more progressive circles. Things have only gotten worse now. So why do you think that test of standing with Israel is a defining issue for Christians, for people of color, and particularly both?
We see, as some of the examples that we talked about here, radical or extremism that Israel stands against us on the front line of that. How Israel's fighting that. Israel, that pluralistic society, Jews, Muslim, Christian, people of all different faiths, who also serve in the IDF, who are fighting for the Jewish state because that's where they are free. That fight is a fight that is happening in the Western world like never before. And so, for Christians, first and foremost, we recognize that what our Jewish brothers and sisters say is true. First, the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. That this fight we see this fight, for example, the war of Gaza, the impending war of Lebanon, as every bit as important as the fight against fascism back in the 1930s and 40s. This is where we are right now. So, again, in the religious context, we as Christians must understand that what our Jewish brothers and sisters are standing against now is what is happening to our Christian brothers and sisters in Iran, in Nigeria, in Sudan, in Syria, that Israel is standing against that wave. And so we need to understand that and do all that we can to support Israel's fight here in the West. If people doubt it, all you need to see is how the more the fighting goes on, the more Israel has to defend itself, the more anti-Semitism rises. It is completely antithetical. Here you have, for example, we were just talking about it, a few weeks ago, Hezbollah fires missiles in the northern part of Israel and kills children playing soccer. And then Jew hatred increases in the West. It is completely insane, and it is completely dangerous because all of the excuses being made for these hateful people to kill Jews, or of course, most of those young people were Jews, but still they see it as Israel. This wave is capturing the West because on our city streets, in New York in a couple of days, there'll be a huge demonstration for Hamas. On our college campuses after October 7th, again, demonstrations for Hamas, not for peace, not for cessation of war, but for Hamas. We see this as something that is engulfing our society as Westerners. And if anyone is wondering where it's going to go, ask our Christian friends in places like Iran. Ask our Christian friends in places like Sudan. And again, I'm going to say this for any of those who are skeptical, they didn't think so either. I had Nigerian Christian friends who saw Boko Haram as certain things, maybe outliers, 15 years ago. They are regretting that now because much of Nigeria is on fire, right? This is what's happening here, that if we as Westerners, and the book doesn't deal a lot with terrorism, it talks about Iran to a certain degree, but it being the defining issue, that's one of the things I would point to. That if we value religious freedom here, if we value the ability to, even if I can get somewhat political, First Amendment rights to actually speak, it's the same thing that happens in those nations in which people are being killed. For example, quick example, mostly Christians and other religious minorities are being killed in some of these regions. Muslims are being killed as well. And often when they're being killed for standing up. I'm a Muslim now. I'm standing up against what's happening to you. They're going to kill me too. This is what's actually happening, right? So there's no free speech. There's no, hey, this is wrong. We shouldn't be killing our Christian brothers and sisters. This is what's happening here. The violence that we see on our streets directed at Jews for having the audacity to defend themselves is a religious violence, I tell Christians all the time, that is coming for us. It will not stop there. They're starting with synagogues. They're starting with Jewish stores. It will shift to churches and Christian-owned businesses and Christians in general as well, because that is the nature of that type of hate.
You make the argument that people should stand with Israel, particularly Black people, particularly Christians, because Israel is fighting on the front lines of freedom, because Israelis are defending a pluralistic society where they enjoy freedom, because they're fighting against the same enemies who would gladly export that violence to the United States and to other minorities and to Christians across Africa. And yet that isn't the narrative that I think is dominant within Black circles. We had on this podcast Congressman Richie Torres, who spoke about how the ideology of intersectionality on modern university campuses has meant that it's impossible to be both progressive and pro-Israel. If you are pro-gay, pro-immigration, pro-Black, then being anti-Israel is just part of that package. And I'm wondering how you think that came about, that linkage between being pro-Black and anti-Israel, and how you begin to disentangle that, this argument about, look, you have to stand with the Jews because they're standing up against the people who are going to come for you too. To what extent are people receptive to that?
Well, one of the distortions that took place over a period of time, last 5 or 6 decades, in the discussion about civil rights, defense of civil rights, those type of things, has been that somehow morality, virtue, being on the right side of history is defined by things like color things like socioeconomic status, right? And not by the actual issues on the ground, right? So to be pro-Black or pro-African-American or for my community, for example, is supposed to have a pride in and of itself in terms of legacy, that it has not supposed to be anti-Jewish, anti-white, anti-Hispanic. But what we've seen, the redefinition, particularly in our college spaces, is that anything white, quote unquote, is bad, right? So you are not white, but you get defined as that simply by your pigmentation, not by your ethnicity, not by your actual identity. That is the binary that was introduced on many different levels, but that's kind of a broader answer to your question.
Right, because instead of dividing the world into good people and bad people, or good causes and bad causes, you're either a victim or you're a victimizer. And if you are, you're oppressed, then you're all on the same tag team.
Yes, yes. And so now what you have in the West more than ever before, this is not new, but it's a stranglehold of the last decade, is that, of course, white is bad, right? Upper middle class white even worse. So a Jew who
is upper middle class white.
Yeah, it was. Exactly. You know what I'm saying? And that has nothing to do with actually fighting for justice. These things aren't really defining anything. They're not actually moving something forward. They're not actually dealing with the real lacks of access, those types of things, right? It's actually dealing with something very superficial, and it becomes a weapon in the hands of those who are extremists, right? So once I've defined the world in that way, a Jew, especially a lighter-skinned Jew, becomes the top of that evil food chain, if you will, right? Now that I've redefined everything, and then Israel, by extension. Israel is a white settler colonial. We've all heard those terms before. None of those things are true, but they get affixed on Israel because of the quote-unquote Jews. So it's not Israel fighting Hamas, an existential war, which is Hamas, which is a proxy of Iran, which is actually orchestrating all of this. It is white Jews fighting against Arabs of color, Muslims and others, and they are simply colonizing. Their imperialists. That has been the narrative, particularly once again once Yasser Arafat took helm of the PLO.
How do we begin to disentangle that? Because it's so obviously false. Yes. Not only because even the quote unquote white Jews are those who were chased out of Europe because they were seen as subhuman, and because half of Israelis, myself included, are descended from Jews who were forced to flee from North Africa and the Arab world. Yes. But also because we have tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews. We had, as one member of the community, Mehereta Baruch-Ron, on the show as well, and she said, we were the original Zionists. We were trying to get to Jerusalem on foot centuries before Herzl. Yes. We had this idea first. She was surprised to see white Jews when she arrived in Israel in the first place. And she said, look, people tell this story about Israel being white settler colony. Not only is it bull, right, but it's bull that erases her from the story. And I spoke to someone a while ago, said, you were speaking to someone black who told them they're going to Israel. I said, oh, you sure? They said, why? Because you're black. How can you go to Israel? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, there are no black people. And they were genuinely shocked. There was just this intense ignorance. So yes. How do we go about disabusing people of those illusions and showing them that Israel is, for all its problems, like a pluralistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic society that is not this white settler colonial state of their fevered imaginations?
I tell people often, we have to have honest and forthright conversations. We have to be willing to address things that, even though they may seem somewhat controversial, we have to unpack it. So, for example, if I've already been sold on the demonization of anything by Dr. King, I'm going to quote him, 1968, he was saying there are some who are color consumed, and they say have kind of mystique in being colored, and anything non-colored is condemned. This is 1968, so he's having the same conversation with Rabbi. What are they talking about? They're talking about the demonization of Israel as a white settler colony. None of this is new, right? And he spoke to it not just in the context of Israel. He's saying, first of all, black, white, brown, we have to get away from demonizing people because of their color, because of their religion. That's the first thing. Because if that person brings that bias to the table, you're not going to be able to have a conversation with about Israel, right? You've already lost the fight. If they already see this is bad, this is good, based on superficial things like skin color, even having the conversation about the fact that when you go in Israel, there's Jews of every hue, black, white, brown, I mean, they're from every white. They're not going to even hear that if they've already sufficiently been duped into thinking that Israel is an extension of the United States. It's an extension of some sort of Western imperial. And I say United States, not that the United States is evil. I'm just saying they see it as an extension. If they've already been duped, if they've already believed, I'll give you an example, one of the controversial ones. One of the reasons why Black Lives Matter gained traction in the way that it was demonizing Israel, even though that's not what was supposed to be going on, was because it immediately jumped on the narrative, these multiple narratives that were false. Number one, white people are evil. False. All law enforcement is evil. False. See, right there is going to trigger people. Oh, no, not all law enforcement. That's not the case. The point was not supposed to be defund the police, which is what they began to do, which 81% of Black Americans were totally against. There was an actual poll done by Gallup, and they polled, and I told people you could have saved money. I could have told you that myself. That's no one's for racist police, but to defund the police from a place like East LA, South Chicago, or are you crazy, right? That's defund the police is what people were saying who lived in very secure neighborhoods who didn't give a damn about what that would actually mean. Why do I bring something up like that? Once you sold something asinine like that, then to tell them that the reason why the police are quote unquote racist is because Israel helps train police, right? Exactly. There's a connection. So by the time you want to untangle the Israel connection, you should have started way over here with this other false statement about what law enforcement was. Are you want to fix bad situations, law enforcement, or do you just have this idea to just, in this kind of anarchist view, destroy structures that are going to be needed by people who need them? And this is what the case is. So once Black Lives Matter had joined in with Jewish Voice for Peace and pushed this whole narrative of defund the police, what we saw happen for the couple of years after that was multiple increased homicides in some of the most vulnerable communities. What in the world does there anything else have to do with Israel and the whole narrative? If you're going to debunk stuff like Israel's a white settler colonial occupier, you have to actually debunk the premise of where you're coming from. What are you actually discussing, right? Because if you've already sold the things that police are all racist, white people are racist, and America's racist, and the West is racist, if you've already sold that, you are not going to succeed at all when you try to defend Israel. I've seen people try to do it. I've seen some of my Israel advocate friends on the left demonize everything Western and then go try to defend Israel. Good luck with that. Good luck with doing that.
I mean, it's disturbing what you're telling me, because we know that the reason that the anti-Israel movement has been so successful is that it tells a story about Israel that slots into a broader story that people are already telling. So you're telling me that actually, in order to try to make the case for Israel and the Jewish community within these minority communities, I basically need to disabuse them of the entire false ideology through which they see the world. I mean, surely that can't be our responsibility to undo that whole woke progressive ideology.
Yes and no. I'm saying yes and no. What I'm saying is that you're absolutely right. That's a huge task, an undertaking that would take several semesters in college. What I am saying, though, is that if you accept the premise that they bring to the table of how evil everything white and Western is, you've already lost. That's what I'm saying. So you're going to have to, I'll give you another example, another political example. Several years ago, and this has been the case, I'm from California, and immigration has been an issue for decades. None of this is new. America has been playing immigration as a political football for a very long time. Legal, illegal, that type of thing. Having grown up with multiple friends of all kinds of ethnicities, right? Hispanic, mostly Mexican, but some El Salvador or those. What was always interesting to me is that when the rage debate would happen around immigration, the people who were most vehemently against illegal immigration were, guess who? My Mexican friends. Why? Because they, whether they were first or second generation immigrants, or whether they had been there for 4 generations, they did not appreciate being assumed that they were illegal immigrants just because they were Mexican. They would get very angry with you. They would also understand that for them, they loved America, and they felt that family in Mexico, family all throughout Latin America. And when they actually immigrated, they did it. It is a very long and difficult process. Why do I bring that up? I had I had personal friends who were then on the left arguing that any discussion around immigration and border security was racist and xenophobic. And they would turn around and talk about their border with Gaza and how they had to secure it. And I would say, but you said that's xenophobic. That's different, Dumisani. You guys don't have terrorists coming across. I was like, first of all, I'm from California. Hezbollah has been in Latin America for the last 20 plus years. That's the first thing. So another gangs type of, so we have security. That's not fair. So for them, an American discussing border security was a racist and a xenophobe. And Israelis discussing border security, that was just common sense. You will lose that argument every time. So the Israel haters said that when you guard Gaza, you're racist. Why don't you let them, you guard the border, the apartheid wall. You see how that works? It slots into an already predetermined narrative. So now you're faced with trying to defend one and allow the other.
And yet, I'm intrigued by the argument, by the point you just made, that while Black Lives Matter was talking about defunding the police,
Yes.
the large majority of the black street was not in favor.
Over 80%. Gallup did a poll of several thousand Black Americans.
Right? Only stark difference there between the politicized, yes, more radical leadership and the people on the street. And I noticed actually an interesting statistic that when one looks at the number of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic incidents across university campuses and the prevalence of what I'm calling the campus intifada, yes, sir, the calls of globalize the intifada and the pro-Hamas protests, they're highest among elite institutions like Columbia and the West Coast. They're lowest among the historically black universities and colleges.
Always been that way.
Why is that?
Because narrative and reality are two different things. People think Twitter is real life, Instagram is real life, and narratives. And so I made that point for many years, for a long time. The campuses that I've been on fire, especially since October 7th, all predominantly white, 0.2% black on those campuses, right? Have HBCUs also entered into the protest? Yes, especially after October 7th. But you're not going to see Jewish students. You're not going to see Jewish professors. And yes, there are Jewish professors on these campuses. They've been there especially since the Second World War. You look at your history, when Jews were fleeing, those professors were allowed in HBCUs who weren't allowed in other white colleges, right? So why is that the case? Because for generally speaking, we are going to deal with the situation on the ground. We are going to deal with what we see as reality. So what you have on the campuses here, not to mention the fact that the billions of dollars that come from Qatar that have been brainwashing our kids for decades, right? What you have is this anti-Zionist thing as an elitist, oftentimes far leftist mentality that is ensconced in these institutions who will take their time to do those types of things. Whereas most of the students on the campuses are there to get an education, to get a job, and make money for their families, right? So for the ones who define themselves as the free Palestine, this and the other, and their parents are paying $60,000, $70,000 a year, those are usually the elite who have a lot of time and a lot of money in their hands to play that game while they drive to school in an $80,000 car, and the rest of the kids are actually trying to just do it the best way that they can. So that becomes a luxury thing. Often the people who are disrupting narratives, who are actually selling all kinds of propaganda, those kids come from very well-to-do families who have lots of money and lots of time to do silly things, whereas other kids are actually trying to their family, if they are paying that tuition as they're paying it, they're having to work several different jobs to actually do it. They'll tell their kids. I'll tell this story. Years ago, I was in San Diego, one of the campuses that was there, and the young man who was over the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter was actually of Somalian descent. We had a long discussion after my presentation. Of course, he had a different view of what I had in terms of Zionism. And at the end of that short story, we talked about human rights and everything. And I asked him, do your parents know what you are doing? He stared at me and was wondering why I was asking that question, because a lot of reasons why I asked the question. He goes, no. See, they were first-generation immigrants from Somalia, and his dad was in some sort of science field, and his mom was doing something else, and he was studying molecular biology, some very, very deep science, and they wanted him to go to school, get his degree, become a good doctor. They didn't know. He wasn't even telling them what he was doing on campus because he knew they wouldn't approve. What's my point? They didn't send him there for free Palestine. They sent him there to go to school. You'll find that's the case oftentimes when black students, Latino students, the ones who are doing that are often white students, sometimes Ashkenazi Jewish students who also have bought into the leftist narrative. That's what you'll see, which is why when you look at those videos, very rarely do you see kids of color. this is part of the reason. It is a socioeconomic and political thing that these kids have come from.
Yeah, when I talk to Jewish students and ask them, who are your allies on campus? Which are the naturally friendly constituencies? Unfortunately, they never tell me African American students. They don't think that they have any possible inroads, which hurts so much because it seems so obvious that there should be such affinities. And so I'm wondering, what advice would you give Jewish students on campus who are looking around saying, how do we build alliances? Wondering, how do we cut through to the to Black American students and convince them of all the things that Pastor Dumisani Washington knows to be true? How do we make them our friends? Because at the moment they're supporting our enemies, those who are politically active at least.
Yes, and so your question is based on the same premise. If you're talking about those schools in which they're predominantly white or have a very institutions, yes, sir. What happens when those Students for Justice in Palestine, Muslim student associations, those student groups, when they form alliances, what's the first place they go to? The Black Student Union. Why do they do that? For the same reason that Yasser Arafat went to Black leaders. They know that their delegitimization of Israel is not going to gain any traction. Nobody's going to listen to them. But if they stand next to Black students and sell it as a justice narrative, people will listen. That's been going on. That exploitation has been going on for a long time. So for the Jewish students who find themselves in that thing, in that, especially by post-October 7th comment, I have to be as honest as I can. For the parents and the students who are listening to that, first of all, if that's the kind of campus that it is, find another school for your kids. My first thing to say.
Okay, but we're talking about Columbia, Harvard, Yale. They're not going anywhere.
Yes.
Stanford. Okay, how do we build alliances with Black students?
For those who persist in going to those schools anyway and giving that kind of tuition to these schools that are actually indoctrinating the kids, first of all, I don't agree. But if they're going to do that, then what I would say then that they have to then be able to build alliances, if that's we're going to use that term, with people who are willing to have those conversations. And that then becomes the challenge. Can I have the conversation? Like we talked about earlier in the interview. Can we discuss even difficult things in a way that we can both kind of share and listen to and hear each other? I say this to the students. One of the reasons why we don't do very many college campus events now, we haven't for a while, not because we don't think it's important, but because we see that the deck is stacked. We recognize that the demonization of Israel that's going on isn't starting with SJP. It's starting with the faculty. So for us, we would say to those students, if you, in as much as you can, build alliances with and conversations with people, whether from the Black students, with the African students that are there, have those conversations so that you can be heard, so that you all can hear each other, right? If you're talking to someone who's not listening to you, who's dismissing everything that you say, as discouraging as it may sound, you're wasting your time.
You think it starts with having conversations with people who are willing to listen? And yet what we see on campuses is a classic bullying dynamic. Well, I speak to Jewish students and they say, like, it's full mean girls.
Yes, sir.
They say, people do not want to be seen with us. I've had Jewish students say that they were in conversation with Palestinians who suddenly say, not, I don't want to talk to you.
Yes.
I can't be seen talking to you because of what the other radicals are going to say. So how do you,
yes, sir.
Part of getting this narrative across is giving other people the courage to stand up to the bullies and engage in that conversation. So what advice do you give Jewish students starting first year at Harvard or Columbia who want to have conversations, to be friends with Black Americans? There's not a lot to ask for.
Yes, sir. So again, whether they're Black Americans or others who are feeling that way, who are shunning them, their task, I hate to say this again, is still the same. In other words, if they are attempting or have attempted to have a dialogue, let's just sit down, let's just talk, and no one is willing to do that with them. That's why I said before, again, as a parent, I wouldn't send my kid to that school, but they're at school, right? So at that point, they have to then form their own, this is where you get obviously the Jewish groups that come together. You are left with no choice. Again, I found that someone is always willing to listen, even if it's a small number. But if they're finding no one to listen, and especially post-October 7th, then they would need to continue to encourage themselves or come together in their groups. Let me do it this way. One of the reasons why, when we talk about the story of the Black American story, how we as a people marginalize, ostracize, this is even post-slavery, right? You have Jim Crow. We built our institutions the same way that our Jewish brothers and sisters did. Because of racism, because of discrimination, that's where you got Black Wall Street from. That's where you got these actual built. So we had to, there was this insular thing that happened for those students now, and I can only imagine the atmosphere on the campuses even now, a year after October 7th. Their insular communities as a source of strength for them to then be able to engage other people. We are, what's really unfortunate about this time that we're in now on our campuses is that many people much smarter than me and much longer than I've been doing this were warning that this is where we've been coming.
Yeah.
I mean, my dear friend Charles Jacobs, who's been in this Israel space and then the anti-slavery space for decades, literally got an award from Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife. He and his crew produced a documentary literally 20 years ago, 2004, called Columbia Unbecoming, in which they sounded an alarm in documentary form about the demonization of Jewish students. The professors that were there teaching all this anti-Zionism, they were saying, hey, then 20 years ago, it's older than that, 20 years ago, he showed the film to the top advocates across the country. No one wanted to be bothered.
And now we're reaping the fruits.
Yes.
Pastor Washington, I want to put just to one side for a moment the question about the relationship between Jews, Israelis, and Black students, and actually put your Christian hat on. Because when I do talk to students and ask them, who are your allies on campus? The first thing they say is the Christians. I had a conversation a while ago with Jewish students and I asked them, why the Christians? And they said, they want us to make Aliyah because then Jesus will come back. I said, that can't be it. That the reason they're standing with Israel or would be open to standing with Israel is because they think that it will hasten the second coming of the Messiah. Why should Christians stand with Israel?
Well, first of all, that belief is held by, from what I know, that actual literal belief, a small percentage of Christians who actually stand with Israel, especially in this.
That's a minority opinion?
Yes. The Christian Zionism that, especially over the last couple of decades, has been born more and more out of an understanding, first of all, biblically, that God's covenant with the Jewish people is God's covenant with the Jewish people. There's no replacement theology. There's no, the church came into being and now the Jews are no longer that. That's the basis of it scripturally, first and foremost. But then also the other part that I was talking to you about the understanding of Israel's fight against extremism, how Israel is free, the one of the fastest growing Christian populations, the safest Christian population in the Middle East is in Israel, right? Arab Christians serving the IDF, all these types of things. These things are known more and more within the Christian community when it comes to Israel, right? That has a lot to do with some great education efforts that happen. So Christians understanding that, it becomes crystal clear. It becomes crystal clear in terms of my faith that the Jesus that I say that I serve was a Jew who lived in first century Israel, who went to the temple. Only he wasn't a Palestinian. Right, exactly. So the Christian who knows that, when they hear Jesus was a Palestinian, which is also part of the KGB indoctrination, they know that's completely poppycock. I can use that term, right? For Christians who understand that, it becomes more and more clear. One of the things that we see happening in the West, particularly the United States now, is the debate around Israel post-October 7th, in which there's been, sadly, somewhat of a rise of anti-Semitism on the Christian right. The Tucker Carlsons, the Candace Owens, they are using ancient anti-Semitic tropes, but for some reason, lots of reasons I can tell you, one of those is biblical illiteracy, is gaining traction with some, I don't know percentages, I can't quote that, with some who are listening to that foolishness. And so here's the challenge. Some Christians are watching that and are doubling down on their stand with Israel because they are seeing, and I've heard the comments myself, they're watching the whole Hamas thing, the Gaza thing, and that's terrible study, but then they're seeing some people who call themselves Christians as well, like the Candace Owens, who are lying to us, oh, Israel's killing Christians in Gaza. So they're now the anti-Semitic, but they're using some of the same Hamas talking points on left and right. And some of those Christians are going, wow, I didn't realize how important it is spiritually, geopolitical for me as Christian to stand with Israel. That's one of the positive things coming out of the very messy situation when it comes to the discussion of Israel on the campus, Israel in society.
Hang on, say that again.
They are seeing some of the Christians who are doubling down on their stand with Israel. They are seeing some of the Christians on the right, particularly, demonize Israel, using some of the same talking points. In other words, they're hearing what the left is saying about Israel, but they were listening to some of the stuff that Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are saying about Israel, and they're seeing how amazingly they line up in a very, very diabolical way. They're lying about the same thing. Hamas says Israel's killing Christians in Gaza. Candace Owens says Israel's killing Christians in Gaza. And they're like, oh, wait. Why are they? And then they're looking at the truth. But the truth is, no, that's not what Israel is actually. Israel's defending itself. Israel's not targeting churches. Israel's not targeting Hamas.
That's interesting that parts of the support for Israel could be a reaction against the extreme flanks within their community. But I wonder, when Jews try to build alliances with Christians,
yes,
it's not just about hastening the second coming of the Messiah.
Yes.
And if I imagine part of it is that Christians are less worried about being accepted by woke, ultra-progressive circles as well.
Yes.
And certainly a certain amount of compassion is needed after, good Christian compassion needed after October 7th. But what is the innate connection? Is it simply an understanding of Jewish indigeneity in the land of Israel that means they're less likely to fall down the rabbit hole of thinking that Israel is some foreign colonial implant? I mean, give me the elevator pitch that you think would be effective for Jewish students trying to build alliances with Christians and saying, here is why you need to stand with us against the nutters who are going too far.
Right. So, and you're asking, what would the Jewish student be saying to the Christians, or vice versa?
How should Jewish students be building alliances with Christians, since you think that the alliance is so eminently natural?
It's interesting that when you're saying that many of the Jewish students are responding to you and saying the Christians are doing it because of the second coming of Jesus. Well, whereas many of the Jewish students and parents that I've spoken to have said they're finding solace in their connection with the Christians because of their defense of their right to exist, because of their defense of it being that Israel is the land of the Jewish people. Like you said, the indigeneity, I can't say that word very well, I'm sorry. And that becomes the basis, right? So what I've heard from Jewish families is that I was with a young lady in D.C. She was doing works Jewish family, and she was preparing to move back to California, where she's from. And she says, Pastor Dumisani, when I go back, I'm going to enroll my kids in a Christian school. I've heard this a lot over the last several years, because I've come to see the Christians as such friends of mine that I would rather them be there than be in some of these other institutions in which they're going to get beat down, or anti-Zionism is how it. Yeah. So that's what I've heard. So I've heard Jewish people say to me, is nothing about this, the second coming of Jesus, all the Jews being gathered. That becomes more and more of an outlier. So I've seen these connections. Obviously, as a Christian, in talking to my Jewish friends, we're seeing that there's more of the closeness that's there because of these shared values. I hate to use that, that term. It's used so much, but it's true. Religious freedom. Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. You see this more and more echoed with the Christians who do understand it and have asserted themselves even more since October the 7th.
Pastor Dumisani Washington, a fascinating conversation about the connection between Israel and the Jewish community and Black community, particularly in the United States, with Christians as well. Thank you very much for your support and your adequacy, and for filming this episode of State of a Nation with us in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with Pastor Dumisani Washington, filmed here on location in Washington, D.C. at the IAC National Summit. As always, if you enjoy these podcasts, please subscribe and like on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, a good review, share it with a friend you think will enjoy and be educated to learn more beyond the headlines and between the lines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thank you for joining us.